Everybody, thanks for coming. Of course, 9:30 on the West Coast. Thanks, Divya, for getting up early and joining us. I'm very excited to host this webinar. We are quite frequently asked about design systems, and obviously we've had the local UX meetup had a couple talks about design systems, so this was a very timely conversation to have. I want to introduce folks in a second here, but basically we're going to talk about why design systems are important, where they come from, the components of design systems, and for folks that don't know about them, also how to best implement them. So we'll cover these aspects as we're going through. It's going to be roughly 35 minutes of conversation, 40 minutes, and then we'll be open for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll synthesize them on the fly and bring them up to our participants. Quick announcement here also. We're going to have the next webinar in a month. It's going to be about the future of health tech. It's going to be an exciting event with a couple speakers kind of speaking about digital and physical products and how to implement them in best case scenarios. It's going to be a mix between health science and health tech. And then if you happen to be in the Boston area or in the province, North Carolina in the next month. So on the 28th of March, we have a health tech mixer. Saloni and Clotilde in our office there will host them. We already have a bunch of people signed up, but please sign up. Saloni is going to post in the chat how to sign up. And then April 25th, we have one in Boston, if you happen to be in Boston on the April 25th. So that's the start. Let's get going. I want to make quick introductions. So obviously, I think this group of experts really comes from a diverse background, and introduce Divya from the West Coast, and maybe you can talk a little bit about your background, and then we have Kenji and Riley jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gregory. I started off my career in tech with Microsoft, building out some mobile apps. At that time, we used to use Adobe, and then gradually we moved over into Sketch. So I'm kind of aging myself here, but I joined LinkedIn, and our first effort was how do we build web and mobile together? And that was my first foray into design systems on how do we really unify the experience between different platforms. So we built out the design system there, and then I joined Google, where we had material design. So I got to use some of the best practices in design. And then most recently, I was at Pure Storage, where again, I went back to an old organization which did not have the design maturity. So we built out a design system from scratch using the best practices that I'd learned at LinkedIn as well as at Google. So that's a little bit about me and my experience in design systems.
Perfect. Well, Kenji, maybe you can put your aspects to this.
Sure. And just heads up, so I'm going to try to bring some good energy today. I'm on week 3. We just had our first newborn baby boy. So yeah, he was born 3 weeks ago. But so background in terms of design systems. So I'm Kenji. I'm a product design lead at Cisco, working on a design system called Magnetic. We support roughly like 40 products so for Cisco Systems, it's mostly in the like security and networking space of things. So it's very much like a SaaS-based design system. Prior to Cisco, so I've been at Cisco for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was at a startup called OpenGov. And then prior to that, I was at Duo, which was part of Cisco. So I kind of boomeranged back from Duo into the broader Cisco. To really the goal of this team was Cisco is obviously like a big company. We didn't have a like unified. We have a bunch of small design systems, and now this system that I'm working on is kind of like the main system that we're trying to unify. So the goal here, my mentor who brought me onto this position was really the goal here was to try to like create a material design, but for Cisco. to make sure that all Cisco products, looked and felt the same and were using the same components. Most of the work I do in design systems on my team is around like complex components as well as design tokens and accessibility related to and colors.
So turning over to Riley.
Cool. Okay. Hi, all. I'm Riley Sykes. I am now a lead product designer at the New York Times. I've been at the Times for almost 7 years now. So I've gone on a whole journey from working on feature teams in kind of like the customer journey, customer experience space. And I think my journey into design systems was because I started using some kind of scrappy design systems that were coming up at the time and was really excited about, the power that they had in creating consistency and bringing people together in their design process. So I transitioned into design systems now almost 3 years ago and have been working on a team with our goal being a kind of foundational shared design system for the whole New York Times product kind of division within tech. So that's the website and the apps. We have a lot of products. We have a lot of sub-brands under the New York Times. And we're really in this kind of early stage of trying to create some alignment across all of those different places through some of the same things we just mentioned around color, space, typography, but also some more kind of complex components that really can help enable teams to do their best work.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think, my plan was really to bring a diverse group of folks that have different perspectives to this call, really, because design systems are very vast and, people can work on, with Riley is a good example on physical design systems that have to become digital, and how do you bridge that gap? People work on dashboards, people work on a myriad of mobile and, desktop applications that all have to be kind of aligned. I'd love to talk about, maybe it's a question for Divya. If you would kind of summarize the importance of a design system, where do you feel is like the core that makes a difference when an organization goes from no design system to a design system?
Yeah, I think the biggest part for the business is to improve the developer and designer productivity. And for the user, the end user, is to have a consistent experience across all the different touch points, whether it's web, whether it's mobile. And I think that's are the two key areas. And it also helps improve collaboration between developers and designers, because there's no more discussions on like, is this the right button with the right pixels, right? It's already codified in a central library. And then we can move beyond the button discussions into flows and the right features to build. So I think it shifts the foundation of the design team into more strategic work.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel that it's a big, and that may be a question for everybody, it's a big push for somebody who doesn't have a design system? Where do you feel is like the selling happening, right? So if a dev team right now does it a certain way, what's been a successful strategy for design team to kind of push for a design system, or like make it happen along very stringent deadlines and agile development cycles? What's worked, what hasn't worked?
So what has worked is partnering with the engineering organization, because they see the value of the engineers getting better productivity over time. It does feel like a dip in productivity because you have to build out the components and all the patterns first. But if you can demonstrate, like I did this exercise with the product team, and listed out, like, if we invested in the design system in the next 2 quarters, here's how it would help us in the next 2 years. And that gradual benefit kind of compounds over time, because it improves productivity longer term for both designers and developers. So doing that exercise, kind of dollar value, right? And then also user value helps demonstrate both to the product and the engineering org why it's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? When you start your career as a UX designer, you do a lot of kind of user research methodologies, and you learn about the right product, building the right product, refining the right product. And then you end up going to an organization and you realize that a lot of your time is going to be in supporting, certain screens in an already built app. So it's really, design system can kind of free you from that chore a little bit by, being able to have the dev team sometimes find their own components or, leverage kind of the work you've done accumulated over your time. I have a question for Riley, because obviously the New York Times design system is rooted in print. How did that work, and how did you even go about that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think honestly, we're still going about it and still trying to figure out the best solutions. I think what our history in print carries along with it, obviously, is rich and complex typography, which I think in many design systems can be a bit of a challenge to organize and document, was even more of a challenge for us, right? Because we have many fonts used across all of our different products. There's multiple serifs, slab serifs, sans serifs, and it can be super complicated. So part of what we've tried to do is to draw some inspiration from some of those early style guides that were used in the print publication, but also trying to modernize that for a digital era. It's a tricky problem to solve, and I think it's going to be one we continue to evolve over time as needs come up. But I think definitely typography is one of the key places where our history has kind of influenced where we've gone as a digital design system.
Yeah, I think one thing in the pre-call that we had discussed was this idea of, leveraging design systems also to be more inclusive and more usable. I'd love to hear from any of you folks like how that is happening, and also, although that's another aspect where you can sell it into organizations, right? Some design systems really need to support inclusion because organizations can get sued now, in certain markets for not being inclusive. Maybe Kenji, you can talk about that a little bit, because I think you've done some really good work there.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there's certainly like the legal aspect that I feel like, what's a famous example? I think Domino's has gotten sued in the past for maybe it was their pizza ordering system not being accessible. So I feel like if all else fails, there's like a legal backdrop to lean on. At Cisco, we aim to follow, right? It's like you're always trying to get compliance to this, but basically aim to follow WCAG AA standards in terms of just like basic accessibility compliance. And then we do a little bit more in terms of just like inclusivity. So that includes, for instance, doing when we do usability testing, the design system side, I can't speak of all of Cisco, but from the design system side, especially for like complex components or big things, like I reworked our color system, we included both Cisco users, and then also we work with an external agency called Fable to test with users with disabilities. So that would be people who have like low vision, color blindness, a variety of different disabilities. So yeah, there's both for sure the, I guess, legal side of things, and then depending on the company, from our design system side, we also lean on the fact that like one of Cisco's, I guess, like mission statements is building an inclusive future for all. So we can kind of point to that in terms of if people are wondering why we're doing certain things in terms of accessibility or inclusivity.
So we've learned about inclusive, and maybe Kenji, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the color aspect of inclusion, right? You did some fabulous work there. Kind of bringing the 40 plus different products up to par from basically colored, inclusion strategy, and how that goes, and especially if folks are, here that maybe work on design systems, what's the best practice? How would you get started? How would that be even a relevant path for folks that maybe don't have the same resources at Cisco on a smaller scale?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm happy to share. I have like a color resource document that kind of goes through everything from like in color testing tools and color like vision simulators to see like how something might look to somebody with a certain type of color blindness. So where do I want to go with this? Yeah, so from like some of the work that I did with Cisco in terms of like revamping our color system was that I think are accessible to folks, you know, even if you're not a big org, is there's a lot of good tools out there that if you don't have access, right, to like test with real people, real users. So there's definitely tooling that you can do to see, okay, for instance, if we're creating data visualization color scheme, right? We want to pick maybe 9 colors or 8 colors that are going to work well together. There's some good tools out there, like Viz Palette, which can show, okay, how differentiable are these to folks with full color vision, and how might this look to somebody with red-green color blindness? At Cisco, some of the work that I've done is basically we have 4 themes we support in both light and dark mode, and one which is like the default theme is the most inclusive theme, which means basically that we have, if you think about like status colors, we have created a set of, you know, warning, positive, negative status colors that are aimed to be as inclusive as possible. So even if you have red, green color blindness, you can see those, as well as like a data visualization palette too, as well, that is differentiable for a wide variety of users, regardless of your level of color vision. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there, but I'm happy to share out if we have things going out after this, basically resources. I can actually probably just drop in the chat if I can find it.
Yeah, if you guys sign up, we'll do a follow-up
Okay.
up from our newsletter for sure. Or if you're already on a newsletter, you probably will get the recap anyway. Also, Figma has some plugins people can use. That's kind of like the first pass. I would say it's always a really good way to test your color palettes. You know, designers tend to pick color palettes what they like, and then they realize, well, you know, these are not going to work from a usability perspective. So it's a little bit of a back and forth. We do a lot of medtech and, you know, regulated industry development, and a lot of these are embedded UIs that live in medical instrumentation. Obviously, the FDA has a lot to say about usability. So it's also encourage everybody to kind of read up on the standards there and kind of get up to speed on stuff if you're working in that field as well. One question came up, and that was basically like very basic. If somebody's on this call and does not know what the design system is, how would you describe a design system in 5 words?
Yeah, well, and I sorry, I asked the question only because, you know, as designers or practitioners, or, you know, however you define yourself on this call, we've probably worked in environments where people don't understand precisely exactly what we do and the value that we bring. And so how do you communicate that to people that just come from a completely different world?
Yeah, actually, one of my PMs put it very, very crisply, which is we are trying to build highways in a city. So it's accelerating how we get people from point A to point B, right? And that really resonated with everybody in the audience. Because if you have roads and you have lots of stop signs and, you know, that's one system, right? That used to be the old way of working. There's El Camino Real in California, right? It's where the missionaries went, and it was, you know, several days to get from point A to point B. But once the highways came in, it really helped sped things up, because, you know, they went around cities and people could go faster because there were all these lanes and ramps and all these faster ways of doing things. And I think that really resonated with the audience, with at least the executive audience, that once you have a design system in place, it helps accelerate the work you do.
Yeah, I feel like I would say a similar thing. I like the prompt of picking 5 words, so I just typed them out. A user interface efficiency enablement service. There's a lot of context packed into all those words, but if I had to choose 5, I think that would get pretty close. To explain that a little bit, it's, you know, obviously we're working with user interfaces. This is so much about the visual appearance of things, and our job is to help enable the efficiency of those of that work, user interface work, being shipped in end products. So and the word service, I think, is a way to reframe. I think sometimes people call design systems products, which I think it's a little bit beyond that. It's kind of the relationship between a bunch of different products, whether it's a Figma library, a GitHub repository. There's so many different documentation resources. There's also like office hours. There's a lot of different aspects to how we frame design systems, at least at the times. And all of those come together as one kind of hopefully cohesive service to help people ship work more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. I think one aspect that is important is this service aspect, right? So, design systems that nobody uses are design systems that are really collecting dust. So as a designer in a large organization, you almost have to see yourself as a service agency that serves the different BD teams on their endeavor to getting better products to the people. And whatever strategy you have to deploy that and make that happen is probably the one you should pursue. Maybe you guys can talk a little bit about that service aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the lesson that we've learned over the last couple of years is I think we started out where many people would assume to start out with a design system is let's figure out the foundational things, right? Color, spacing, layout, typography, and all those things are still useful for sure. But I think there are so many things that a design system can bring that are useful. And what we've learned is actually we maybe started with the stuff that's a little bit less useful. If you think about colors, if you have color tokens, very helpful to have. But how much quicker is someone able to ship a feature if they have a bunch of colors available? Some, right? Because you're not just figuring out a hex value from scratch. You have a color that has kind of a name associated with it, maybe gives you instructions for how to use it. But there's only so much efficiency you get out of that, where what we've focused on this year is components that will be used in feature teams' work that is planned for this upcoming year. So we know that out of the gate, they're going to have to figure out how to put a tooltip in the newsreader app, for example, right? And that's a lot of work for a team to figure out how do I make sure it positions itself properly? Should it go above or below, or maybe both? What styles should I use for that? How is it offset from the environment around it? These are all really tricky questions that a lot of teams currently have to take on answering themselves one by one every time they ship a feature. What we can do is come in and say, hey, we know you're going to need a tooltip for this project. We saw a couple other teams over here too that might want that as well. What if we take that work off of your plate, give you a tooltip for your upcoming launch, and you can focus on shipping the best feature possible, doing the right user testing, making sure you're going to make as much impact for the business that your team is trying to make. And that's how we think about being more of a service, is that our work is in service of what other teams are trying to ship.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really good insights. Kenji, I'm gonna call you out on the color aspect because I think that's also another thing. I had the benefit of seeing your presentation about color, but I think that's also something that's really tricky, right? Testing color, making sure it works right across all different products. That's also something where you could potentially, take a feature team's time off or help a feature team by kind of working through those aspects. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your journey there.
Yeah, so I think, and even just following up on the last point or the answer from Riley, I think even just step back, right? If we think about, so prior to design system, I was working as like a feature designer product on a product, working at a whatever, let's say a settings page or whatever it is, right? Where you're like, your users are the end users of the product. So for me, it would be in that case, like IT admins. Now working at Cisco in the design system, right? Like we're really servicing, Riley kind of mentioned all the designers or the engineers who are shipping the products. So it's kind of a bit of a mind shift in terms of just like the way we interact with our quote users, or really consumers, we call it for the design system. But just kind of calling that out there as like that's like who we are servicing. In terms of, sorry, can you repeat that question, Gregor?
No, remember, I mean, you basically changed the color of some of these dashboards.
Yeah.
It would have been an enormous amount of work for each feature team to do. But by you consolidating it as like a, as in your work path, you basically took, gave them colors that their dashboards could be deployed with, that were very relevant and used already, user tested, and kind of pre-vetted per se, right?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at here is essentially just like the speed or efficiency. So that way, if you're a designer, so let's say working on a chart, you don't have to think about, oh, are the colors I'm selecting, are they passing color contrast, or maybe you're not even thinking about that, right? You can kind of just like pull a chart component from our library, let's say a line chart, which comes preloaded, let's say with 9 lines, and you know that because it's coming from magnetic, that it's been like stringently tested. It passes color contrast. And so you're really worrying about the end design rather than trying to play around with like this color or that color. Now, of course, everyone has opinions on color. So I get questions all the time of like, hey, can we change this color? Can we change that color? And oftentimes it's like we've created some flexibility. So maybe we have different color sequences, for instance, for data viz, to appease people's like aesthetic preferences. So that's like the kind of the service aspect, but then it's really you're servicing like in this case, the speed of things. So by doing all this upfront work and loading that onto our design system team, the end designer doesn't have to do really like a lot of the basic stuff around color, like even thinking about color contrast, if they're using text or they're plopping an input field, or using charts, right? They know that if it's coming from magnetic, the basics of color contrast, for instance, are going to be covered.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring up another aspect on this, because obviously there's always a little bit of a friction between the marketing teams of organizations and the dev teams of organizations, especially when it comes to design. How do you get buy-in? Like, obviously, the design system by definition is an extension of a brand, right? So it really is a visual representation in digital space that is sometimes rooted in brand colors and brand principles that are sometimes developed by a team that's very far away from the product, right? How is that conversation happening, and where do you see best kind of insights in managing the discrepancies between a brand and a design system?
I can speak to that.
Go ahead.
We actually had a logo. Portworx was one of the acquisitions for Pure, which was the business unit I was in. And when we did kind of an analysis, we found that the Portworx logo was not actually accessible. They used a certain orange that when you put it on a screen was just not high contrast, right? And when you look at the brand guidelines as part of Pure also had an orange, and there was standardized accessibility done, more rigorous brand guidelines. And for us, we had to move from our Portworx logo to the new orange, old orange to new orange. And as the design team, we were like, of course, yes, that's the right thing to do for accessibility, right? We're part of a bigger company, and that already has a standardized orange. But there was a lot of developer work to go and update all the places where the old logo was. So it is engineering work, right? And sometimes it's also design work to go and update that stuff. But I think once you get that buy-in, why it's important, and conveying that story, to your point, Gregory, around the brand and the unified story with the new broader company, and why it's important for accessibility, right? All those things kind of compound to giving the design rationale as to why, and then that helps get the work done.
Right. And I think that's, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because years ago, I was at the company when they went through a rebrand, and it was one of those organizations where marketing was very much like not as tied into the product teams. And we ended up getting the presentation of the new product brand that we were supposed to use in our products. And we realized that, yeah, it couldn't be printed. It couldn't be, there was all kinds of issues with the logo. And it was a huge effort to kind of get that, to resolve that, where if they would have come earlier and say, well, here's the 3 directions we're working on, let's do pressure test some of these, would have been a lot easier.
Absolutely. And to your point, when we were doing the design system explorations, we took our marketing team along, like monthly sync ups, getting in front of the marketing leads, the brand leads on the pure side, even the product folks on the pure side, that this is where our design system's headed. Here's our mood boards, here's our big visual explorations, here are our dashboards, here are like our key screens mocked up differently, just so that they understood the process on why we were making certain design decisions, so that when we came to the end of like picking our colors, our brand, font, sizes, like choices, they knew why we were there.
Mm-hmm.
100% agree. Brand, product, as well as dev need to work together.
Yeah, and I think that's the big story of design systems, right? It's kind of the nucleus of an organization, where it really goes deep into marketing, it goes deep into dev, it goes deep into the business, you know, even. And the closer you align with all these key stakeholders, the better it is. Kenji, I'm glad you're bringing up the Lyft story, which is a famous one, right? Where they actually had a brand that wasn't really working, and they had to, you know, actually spend a lot of effort getting through that. But as we are kind of getting into the second part of our conversations, I'd love to talk a little bit more about kind of your best practices in evolving design systems. I think, you know, there's one aspect of building a design system, but then the evolution and the maintenance can be very tricky, right? Especially as, you know, new teams come on board through acquisition, or, you know, developers are really, you know, legacy products have to be implemented or brought up to speed. You know, famously, I think a lot of big organizations that have grown very rapidly, like Salesforce, you know, have a hot mess, because, you know, every aspect of their business has a very distinct, different quality to it. And, you know, the questions there really are more about, how do you bridge design systems, right? How do you make it more cohesive? Because sometimes it's not even possible to create a common design system from scratch with such a large organization. Where's the band-aids?
I can hop in on this.
Good insights?
This one, yeah. So for the team that I'm on, actually at Cisco, it's a bit of a, maybe this happens at other companies. It probably does too. But basically, our design system, the one that's being, you know, kind of scale, it started out with being used as one product within Cisco, and then from there it started kind of build up steam, and more networking products brought on, and so now it's scaled up. So, but the challenge is, right, like, things that worked for one product, right, are not going to work in one particular industry, are not necessarily going to work across all of the Cisco products. So it'd be like something coming out of YouTube, a design system coming out of YouTube might not scale so well going into like Google Drive or something like that. So a lot of the things that we work on now in terms of scaling that up around are have to do with like processes, right? Thinking about how we intake component requests or change requests from teams. Also, I'm less involved in this, but just making sure like the code base is accessible, right? To not accessible in terms of like accessibility, but like people can access it across the company, whether they're in a certain business group or another business group. But a lot of the work we are doing, yeah, is making sure that, and then also as we create new components, that instead of just designing for like one product, right, ensuring that, for instance, I worked recently on our main navigation, that this nav can work across, you know, all of our stakeholders, basically. And so there's going to be some things that like work better in other products, or they don't work as well on some products. So some like pros and cons. But yeah, I think as we've grown and continued to evolve this design system, it's been the challenger has been kind of like scaling it from one product to be able to support 40. And a lot of that too is around processes, and not only how we intake, but also how we design too as a design system team.
Mm-hmm. Which, you know, brings me to the next question. So obviously, you know, with technologies changing, and, you know, I would say component libraries evolving more into, you know, UI elements or UI components that actually are code driven, you know, access to that code base is becoming crucial, right? So, we recently had a conversation with a new client, and they'd never heard of Figma before, right? So it's there's dev teams out there that actually are really in very different hemispheres when it comes to building these systems. So a lot of times, how do you even bring a design token or a UI component to a developer, as they're maybe not as familiar with it as you like to have them be. I'd love to hear your perspective on what happens there. None of you guys are coders. How do you have that dialogue?
Yeah, on our team, I think when we first proposed the design system for one of the projects, so we started small. We said we're building this new product. How about we take the onboarding flow and build this onboarding flow using the new design system? So it was a net new product, and that could demonstrate using the design system with a new wizard, so new interaction patterns, new visual patterns. And then as we started working with the developers, we found one or two folks on the developer team that were very interested in scale and consistency and craft. And those were our biggest allies, because in the old way of working, they had custom buttons everywhere. Things were inconsistent. These are the folks that would ping me, our UX is broken, right? So I would actually call them out and say, hey, we need to build this flow. And would you guys be interested in working in this? Because, you really craft matters to you and you're building this new design system. So having those first few developers on your side build out the component library, it takes time, right? For them to take out effort from their feature work to go out and build the design system. But once it's there and once it's in the storybook library, which is the dev library, then it's much easier to standardize the components and then build out the wizard flow and then reuse it. But finding those first key allies, which are direct developers, less of the managers or the leadership, really goes a long way in helping build those relationships with the development team.
Yep. I mean, thanks, Riley. Thanks for bringing this up, because I think, finding allies is always important, right? Within the business team, within the dev team, the folks that really want to make a difference and feel like a design system can help them normalize the vision of a product. Years ago, I've had a conversation, and I think one of the other aspects that I always thought was really important about design systems is it can become a Trojan horse for a much more consistent design language across an organization by really, as we talked in the beginning, bringing the benefits of speed, consistency, efficiency to the table. But at the same time, also, obviously for us as designers, we care about the visual and the usability aspects of these products. And also ultimately, the business will care about usability and accessibility. And the easiest products are the ones that are designed well. And as designers, sometimes we feel like we have an uphill battle with the dev team to get there, right? So this design system can become the Trojan horse of getting us closer to that ideal than just, basically advocating for good design by itself. Obviously,
we didn't have the expertise in-house. We actually worked with an agency to do some of that token work and that initial design work, because we didn't know how to best implement it. So sometimes working with best practices in the industry, reaching out to folks that have done it, can help you get to doing it faster, right? And get over that initial hump of doing it yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's a really helpful aspect too. I mean, I spend half of my life on the corporate side, half of my life on the agency side. And I feel sometimes also as an agency, you have more of a permission to be the change agent, because, you're ultimately going to go away, and you're not as tied to the different aspects of the business. So you have maybe even as an internal design team, sometimes working with an external agency can help you kind of make everybody happy, because they're the experts, they're coming to help us, and then once it's implemented, then you can basically continue the work and really take it to the next level. So we are about 20 minutes in. I don't know if anybody has, to the end, I'm sorry. If anybody has questions, put them in the chat. We can keep going and kind of bring them up. I think one aspect we haven't talked about was really timeline. If anybody on this call, has never implemented a design system, what's a typical time frame that you should expect to get from 0 to hero, or even to a first round? What is realistic, right? I mean, obviously, the larger the organization, maybe the longer it takes, but I'd love to hear from you where you feel you have learned in your journeys how to kind of pace yourself to get these things implemented.
Yeah, so such a good question, because I feel like, one answer is it depends, right? There's so many factors that go into it. How big is your design system team? Is there even a team at all? Is it one person? Do you have just designers there? Are there engineers as well? And it also depends on what you are aiming for with that first milestone. I think we learned this lesson through our design system. So the one that I've been working on since the last couple of years and a half, we call it Times product language. And our goal was that there were a bunch of kind of smaller, more siloed design systems in different parts of the organization that were kind of grassroots design systems, for lack of a better word, which is really great. But obviously, if those are in their own spaces, it's hard to find the kind of consistency between them. So our hope was, let's create one umbrella where all these design systems can come to live over time, by kind of bringing their shared elements together, and also helping to uphold the things that are important about them that make them distinct from each other. Where we started with that, because that's a huge goal across so many products and services at the times, is to start with the foundations, like I mentioned before, right? So color, spacing, typography, a few basic components like buttons. And that was our 1.0 Times product language foundations release. So that, for us, a team of around 5 to 6, half and half design and engineering, about a year and a half, 2 years to get that ready. But I think what we've learned is that, at least at an organization of this size, a design system is never really done, and there's always so much more to do, so many more components you could work on. So I think we've tried to be a little bit less ambitious, actually, about what our end milestones are, and to take away that concept of an end milestone, and instead break it down to just what components are we going to work on, this half or this quarter. That's a milestone. And then we start the process again. What else do teams need in a quarter or a half from now for their upcoming work? Then we ship and implement that. And it really is just kind of a one thing at a time process, especially for us as we're at this kind of early stage. And I could see that work going on forever. So I'm not sure when the end is, but that means that I'll have some good job security, at least for some years going forward.
Right. Speaking of job security, right, I think one of the challenges of design system designers is that we've had quite a bit of tech layoffs, and it's easy to justify a UXer in a dev team, but having a centralized design system team is going to be on the chopping block pretty quickly once the BD P&L is being run, right? So the question really is how do you communicate your value constantly to make sure that you can keep doing the work you want to do across an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like a big timeline question for something that's smaller and newer, for Pure at Portworx, we built out a design system in roughly 9 months, where the first 3 months was doing the audit. So we stepped back, did a heuristic evaluation, really understood what the existing system was, competitive audit, the selling part, right, was the first 3 months, where why do we need a design system? And then once we got that buy-in, the next 3 months was building out the components, the visual exploration, settling on a language, getting stakeholders to agree, right? This is the language going forward, and our system pieces and like the view before and after of the different products. And then kind of next 3 months were more into patterns and execution. But this was for a brand new product, right? If you think about LinkedIn, it was about 18 months of the mobile work. And testing cycle for something as big as LinkedIn was we would break it down into like top 10 pages. So starting with the home page, which is the number one thing that people come to on LinkedIn, we would test that out first, and then see if it's meeting all the rigorous standards, all the cards open, like the flows go well, and then go down to the next few flows. So it's kind of iterative, and you try to break it down into smaller teams and smaller projects so that it can be tackled independently by the different feature teams.
When you do these testings, do you do A/B testing or do you just do usability testing?
For something like navigation, which we also changed as part of LinkedIn redesign, we did do an A/B test, which stayed for 6 months because a lot of people don't come to LinkedIn, for 3 months, 6 months, only when they're, looking for a job or when they have a message. So we let it stay and did the A/B test for about 3 to 6 months before we made final changes. You let the metrics stabilize and then come to some reasonable decisions. But for some of the other things like homepage feed redesign, I feel like there's less of A/B testing because you want to move over to the new design, regardless of what the metrics would be. But yes, you do try to make sure that the engagement stays, right? Or the key metrics that affect the page don't considerably go down.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because I think working with the metrics can help you justify design systems, also can help you what's not working, and really becomes a leading indicator for the success, as you're working with the dev team of your design creations in the field, per se, right?
Right, yeah.
Any questions? Let me see if there's anything coming up. Yeah, so Leland had a question about test cycles for large scale design systems. I think we touched upon it a little bit, but also I would say anybody who's building a design system, there's very useful tools for doing, I would call it almost iterative testing, not waiting. So no code iterative testing is, I would say, the first step that I would always recommend, and maybe you guys can get your feedback, but don't wait for it to be in code a lot of times. I mean, that's really more the final test or the summative test, right? Your formative testing can happen while you're building out your Figma components, and it can be really deployed across organizations very effectively, or even with, like a panel of users that you're friendly with that you might have to, go on for other things, right? So I would say, don't wait for testing till you're done. I would say it's an evolutionary path for sure.
Yeah, I think also at an organization of our size and the kind of the format that we have set up, right, where we have these kind of pilot teams we partner with, that user testing, both qualitative and quantitative through A/B testing, is kind of built into their processes. So the nice thing about this new kind of approach that we're following now is that the teams who want our components are going to also want those to be tested and impactful, and that will be built into their process automatically. It's a little bit trickier for us as a design system team to kind of get into the planning schedule for different types of user testing. We don't have a data analyst or scientist on our team compared to what most product teams at the Times have. So that's where leaning on other teams and their kind of upcoming plans is advantageous both to them and to us.
I want to talk about this a little bit because I think I've heard this from other large organizations that it used to be that the UX team would do everything, right? So they would do research, they would do workflows, they would work on the kind of product definition, and then they would develop the product, and then they would work on the design system. And nowadays there is like, product teams, and there is design system teams, and there's research teams. And a lot of times, like, the agile cycles of the development dictate how certain teams have to work together. But sometimes, you don't get the research because you already have to start with the components. And, you have to. So how do you manage that kind of dialogue effectively, right? Where disparate teams are doing different things.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we're right in the middle of that right now. One thing that is really helpful in the process for me is being thoughtful about how you gather requirements for your components that you're building. So requirements is a word that we use to just describe like what should the component offer to our feature teams that are using them. I talked about tooltip earlier. Do all teams want to make sure there's a little like pointer caret at the bottom of a tooltip? Do some want that removed for some reason? It's just floating unpinned. And one way you can get at that is to look at examples of tooltips that they've built already. If they have any examples of design mocks for upcoming projects where they hope to use a tooltip or any component. And then from there, you can start to build some assumptions of what a more kind of reusable, centralized version of that component would be, taking inspiration from all the different inputs that the teams you're working with have given you. And then it's really just like having a conversation with them. I find it's really useful to come with examples of what this potential component could look like, but being upfront about your confidence level in that component. Because I think sometimes you can come with a design mock and people say like, oh, wait, are you like about to ship this? It looks so polished, right? But if you come into the room and say, here's some assumptions I've made, like, I think maybe we should have a drop shadow behind it and there should be a little caret and maybe there's a title and a description paragraph and maybe a little X to close or something, just based on what I've seen. But I'm like, I don't know, maybe like 20-30% confident that's the way we should go. Like, what do you guys think? Like, do you want to make sure that we have a drop shadow, or are drop shadows not Timesian enough for you, right? That's a word we throw around at the Times to see like, does this feel like the New York Times or not, for example? And I think that can be a really productive way to both take the work off of teams' plates to consider all the options, come in with a recommendation or a suggestion, and see how strongly they react to it. They could reject it entirely, and that's really good information because it's like, all right, I need to completely rethink where I was going with this. Or they could be like, yeah, this sounds great. I honestly don't care if there's a drop shadow or not. And then that gives me room to kind of make those decisions for them.
Who makes the decision? I mean, that's a question for you, Riley. Who makes the decision that it's timesy enough?
It's such a good question. I mean, Timesian is a tricky word at our company in general. I think especially featured teams feel like it can be used to stick with tradition, I guess, in some ways, right? Like not be as like exploratory or groundbreaking from a product design perspective. At the same time, it is what makes the New York Times feel like the New York Times. And I think that's where the brand team is probably the biggest champion of what Timesian means and how to define that. We're still figuring out the best relationship between brand and our product teams, but I think both our brand team and our team have seen so much opportunity in us connecting and kind of aligning and hashing out some of these questions. I see the design system team as kind of like a facilitator of alignment, a kind of a negotiator of middle ground, I guess, between these different groups, because from a brand perspective, actually, this is one we were just dealing with recently. They might want us to use our New York Times fonts for every single component in the system, right? There's a specific component in iOS that we could reuse within our system called a contextual action menu. Basically, a little menu pops up. It's got a bunch of actions within it. You can click one and carry on. It's really, really functionally super useful. But Apple doesn't allow you to override the font of that modal. So what do? Do you listen to brand who says we should only use our fonts? Or do you listen to feature teams that could get so much value out of this component that otherwise would be almost impossible or like super challenging to recreate from scratch? We then that's where the conversation happens. I don't know, there's no one answer, but I think that's what the conversation will get you to. And right now where we're landing is brand isn't a big fan of not being able to use our fonts. I think they called it maybe a necessary evil for now. And maybe that's where we're at, maybe that's how brand feels about some of these choices, but at least we got them to be like, okay, let's go with it and see how it goes. We can change things in the future. That's already, I think, a big step from where we might have been like 5 years ago. And pardon my cat if you can hear him screaming at us.
Yeah, is there anything, that's a Leland question, is there anything that the digital team incorporated that actually made it back into the print version? Is this a two-way street or is this a one-way street?
Oh, that is such a good question. I wouldn't say through any types of like design system or style guide perspective, but I think there actually is like a really amazing relationship between the digital news team and the print news team. I think especially with the more, we call them interactive articles. These are the more kind of groundbreaking, unusual formats that happen only on web. And I think there's a really interesting process when it starts from that place. How do you then translate that into print? I'm not the expert on that. I haven't worked on that myself, but I'd say that's probably the main way right now where the digital work kind of influences back. And that happens a lot more in the newsroom space than it does between maybe digital product teams and kind of print standards.
I think it's funny, right? So, a lot of times when you consume media, as a New York Times reader, obviously, many times you don't even remember where you saw something first. You might have an iPad app and you might have the website and then you might have the physical. And there's always this deja vu where you realize, did I read this first on the digital version or did I actually read it on the physical paper? And it's really interesting how the contextual design of these elements really influences your perspective, right? So it's fascinating.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, like I talked about before with typography, right, that there's a lot of power in font choices, and that's why we have created that consistency between our digital and print elements, that we use different headline styles to represent different things, whether it's, a really big important story like Trump wins, I think, was in a all caps Cheltenham italics at a very large size that we never used before. So those are some of the things that are very subtle, but can create the feeling that like, oh, the New York Times has never used a font style like this before. This has got to be like a special moment. Some of those things you can't always put your finger on, especially as just your everyday user, but can have a real kind of emotional impact when you're reading either on the web or in print.
Yep. Well, we have 3 more minutes before the end, but I'd love to, actually touch on that before, because obviously, I mean, Divya, LinkedIn is a strong brand. New York Times is a strong brand. Obviously, Cisco has a very strong, I would say, contextual presence across their products. Maybe with all you guys' help, these have been established. But how is that happening? How is that dialogue in a design systems team around those contextual elements of a brand? Is that forefront or is that pretty much just like implied as you're building these components?
Yeah, I can speak to it briefly, and I'd love to hear what y'all have experienced as well. It's a tricky space, honestly, because of what I said before, of we're trying to be in service of feature teams. In the best case scenario, feature teams, and I think for the most part, really do want to embrace the New York Times brand and reflect it through their work. At the same time, if they want to do some really interesting new idea, that can feel in conflict. And so it kind of is a case-by-case basis where we're kind of trying to connect the dots and mediate that kind of alignment between what a brand team might see as Timesian, what a product team might see as kind of an innovative new feature, and where can we land in the middle?
Yeah, and a question for Kenji, actually. Has some of your work kind of influenced the hardware design decisions as well as the UX decisions?
That one, not as much. I think there's only one thing that sticks out in terms of we have one main product, Meraki, that has like ports, this on the networking side of things. So it's more so representing how we reflect that in the design system, in the product, in the, let's say, the port diagram as our design system component, right? How is that reflecting or not reflecting? How close does it have to match what's in the real world? On the brand piece that you were just talking about, I was thinking for us at Cisco, we're really kind of trying to move from like a house of brands, right, to like more of a branded house. So thinking in terms of the challenge, that one of the challenges we're kind of punting every quarter, but it's thinking about just like basically how much of a individual brand, let's say Duo or Meraki or any of these individual brands, like how can you bring part of their brand presence in while also like living within the design system, basically. So there are ways, obviously, with color or iconography, that type of thing. But it is, I think, a fine balance that we're kind of working towards. That's probably gonna be in the next, I think this coming year is something just figuring out, yeah, how to keep, I guess, from like a Cisconian vibes, right? How much to keep this feel like a branded house while allowing each team to have certain elements or something that reflects their individual product brand as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Divya, that actually to you used to work at Microsoft, and Microsoft, for a while, they purchased Skype, and a lot of their like high value kind of high visual elements were just not really branded at all, right? In the Microsoft brand. How was that managed internally, and how did you get from kind of these discrepancies to a more cohesive language?
Yeah, so Skype was very interesting because it was largely a consumer product, and then it got merged into one of the Office products and became Link, which is now Teams. So becoming part of that Office suite, right, and having that kind of brand was essential. So they did keep Skype on for like 2-3 years, supported it for consumer for a while, but I think eventually the product evolved, they did a rebrand, and then kind of named it differently and put it part of the larger cohesive Office suite. So I think that's where I feel like aligning to the broader Microsoft story, because you want it to be part of your day-to-day work, right? And if you're a user, you're using their Outlook, and you're also using, Skype, which is now Teams. So that alignment makes sense from a brand and user experience perspective. So I think the tech stays in some part, but the product evolves or the service evolves and becomes part of the Microsoft brand.
Well, thank you. We are at the hour. It was a fascinating conversation. I knew this is going to be a good one. So I'm very excited. Thanks for all spending time here. And we will definitely, if you want to sign up for the newsletter, or even if you already signed up, we're probably going to send all these links out after the call, so you have them. And we're looking forward to the next sessions. Thanks, our panelists. And we'll see you next month. Take care.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.